Hello, man. Welcome back, hopefully. You're part of the tribe, liking, subscribing, following. If this is your first time you've listened, then welcome. What are we going to be talking about today? Civil War 2.0. Now, I recently discussed this in a Q&A. Somebody asked me about it. And I'll be honest, I've thought about it quite a bit and was reluctant to talk about it. But if you guys are curious about it, maybe I can share my training and experience in related fields with you. I'll likely put this out first on Alpha Male Podcast and then Gunfighter Life, as it's kind of both podcasts adjacent. I actually have far more listeners regularly on Gunfighter Life. However, I think some of the most meaningful episodes come out on Alpha Male Podcast. So I'll probably put this out first on Alpha Male, and then I'll probably put it out on a day when there's an opportunity on Gunfighter Life. That being said, I'll put in a quick version of the bio and then expound on that, on how it relates to today's topic. And I'll probably start with just a brief recap of the answering of that question from the Q&A, and we'll get deeper in depth on that. Bio. First and foremost, I am a Christian. That is number one in my life, serving God, following Jesus. Combat veteran, served in the United States Marine Corps and the Army. Also law enforcement veteran, private contractor, state rifle and pistol champion. Professional big game hunter and guide. If you feel called to support, check out Patreon. There should be a link in the show notes. With that, I am your host, Michael Melito, and I am blessed to serve you today. Okay, I've talked about this before, but in addition to the normal quick bio, I was there for the initial invasion of Iraq. I joined the Marine Corps pre-9/11. I was there in Kuwait waiting for the war to start. I was actually part of, let's just say, a more specialized unit. I'm not really going to expound on that, but I was in Baghdad before it really went downhill. I was there in a safe house operating where things were fairly normal, in a part of Baghdad that was fairly normal. And although they spoke a different language and culture was slightly different, it was a giant metropolitan city, much like New York or LA, functioning. I believe there was a Jewish quarter and a Christian quarter, and Muslims there, and all manner of different people. What you would call Caucasian, white people, however you want to quantify that. Very multicultural, a very normal functioning city. And then we invaded it, liberated it, destroyed it, whatever your political view is on that. But it quickly descended from a normal functioning city to a broken, fractured shell of its former self. And there were different factions, in that power vacuum. So, unlike many of the other deployments that came later, of which I came back later as well, but a lot of the people that came back in subsequent years only ever saw that country torn apart. They didn't get to see it as a functioning society and then torn apart. A fairly unique view, and I don't wish for carnage and chaos. I'm blessed that God got me through that in one piece, and I get to kind of share those experiences and that real-world experience. Also, my years in law enforcement in major metropolitan areas and then the commander of a tactical team to stop active shooters, that was our main bread and butter, but we did other things too, and I've had to deal with civil unrest and civil strife here, CONUS. Now, thankfully, it didn't descend to the level of, the complete destruction of a normal society, but I've seen the beginnings of that, and thankfully it tipped back the other way. But that's some unique experience that I have, and as a combat veteran of war, although not a civil war, I can glean some of that as well. With that, with those establishing some where I'm starting from here, let's get into Civil War 2.0. So, as alluded to, the first part of this is going to be from that Q&A. And we'll go into much deeper depth. The question was asked by North's something. What are your thoughts on a second American Civil War? How would it go down? What if Texas seceded? Texas seceded and other states followed. Will there be an active conflict or will it be less violent? All right. Yeah. Going to the Bible again. The Bible has very, very specific things against false prophets. Let me be clear here. I don't see the future. I don't know the future. I have gotten no prophecy from God, from the Holy Spirit, on a second American Civil War. I don't know about Norse, but I have been to war. I've been to war twice. War is a brutal, brutal thing. What I will say is I don't look forward to an American Civil War because I've seen war, and I abhor war as only a man who has been to war can. Now, I still think a good, strong alpha male should have the propensity be able to wage war, especially a just war and just conflict. There is a time for righteous anger. There is a time for war. Ecclesiastes tells us that. There's a time for peace and a time for war, and I think you ought to be ready for that. Jesus also tells his disciples, if you have no sword, sell your cloak and buy one. If you want to put that into modern context, men, I don't know, if you have a video game, Nintendo, whatever, Xbox, whatever is hot right now, you're spending money on that and you don't have a Glock, you don't have a good, dependable fighting system, maybe sell that and buy one. That said, American Civil War, I don't think you want it. Looking back at the first Civil War and civil wars in modern times in like Africa, look at how young and old the men were that served in the first American Civil War. I knew that there were very young men serving in the American Civil War. As much as we might paint the Union as the good guys and the liberators in this. This is from Wikipedia. I don't know if these numbers are exactly correct. Do your own research. It is estimated that 100,000 Union soldiers were under 15. Let me read that verbatim. It is estimated that 100,000 Union soldiers were 15 years of age or younger. Yeah. Is that what do you want that to happen again? Do you want your young men, I believe as young as 11, dying in Civil War? And I'm not talking about dying from famine, dying from Germans' march to the sea. I'm talking about like dying in battle. Like, do you want your 11-year-olds, storming trenches and seeing those horrors? I've seen 2 accounts of 11-year-olds serving in the American Civil War. And I heard some pretty shocking statistics recently. I didn't know this question was coming up, just by like history. And what percentage of the adult male population died in the American Civil War? And I see varying accounts of that, so I'm not going to give those numbers here, but a lot. A very high percentage of the adult male population, 11 and up, dying. And not just from bullets, a lot from disease and dysentery and all those things. And I would really caution. A lot of, I think, times we have a romantic view of war, and I certainly did as a young man. I joined the Marine Corps at 17. I joined pre-9/11. When 9/11 happened, I was, to be honest, excited and thought war would be glorious. And then I went to war. War is not glorious. War is filthy and horrible, and I really hope that we don't see a violent civil war here in America for the reason that I've been to war, and I don't want to see a lot of young men, American men or any other men, lying dead on a battlefield without a just cause being behind it, for war, for profit, for one political side to get power over another. I don't want to see any more young men dead. I've seen that before, and I don't want to see it here. It's bad enough seeing it in the sands of Iraq. And again, I don't see the future. But here's what I can say. Civilizations collapse. It's what they do, right? Civilizations collapse. Ancient Babylon to Rome, the Hittites, the Philistines, the Greeks, the Romans, the Persians, the Vikings, the Holy Roman Empire, the Prussians, the Austrians, right? Some of those places, those cities still exist. Like, people still live in Rome, but those empires are gone. The British Empire is a shadow of what it once was. It's still a nation, but as far as, the sun never setting on the British Empire and it ruling the seas, empires collapse. It's what they do. Our civilization is America is fairly young as a country. I mean, civilizations collapse. It's what they do. Now, again, I'm not a prophet. Is that going to happen in a year, in 50 years, in 100 years, tomorrow? So I don't see the future. And exactly how a Civil War 2.0 could play out, I think is futile. Is it going to be Texas versus the other states? Is it going to be, there could be a bunch of different scenarios. I don't think it's going to be the exact North versus South again. Is it going to be the liberal coasts versus the conservative interior? Is it going to be two factions, or is it going to be more like balkanization, which is its own deep study? Perhaps that should be its own episode on the balkanization, the possible potential balkanization of America. But, from Yugoslavia, I think right now there's others, but Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia, Serbia, Montenegro. Could the United States no longer be so united? And could we have, because America does have several subregions, could it be, New England with a lobster banner, a lobster ensign? They have a lot of similar cultural ties and ideologies. And then the Tidewater is its own thing, the Mid-Atlantic, Virginia, Maryland, Delaware-ish region, which has its own rich traditions. And then you have, the Midwest Great Lakes region with its strong union kind of job, industrial, post-industrial culture, values, and labor and trade unions in the Great Lakes region, maybe with an automobile and a snowflake on its ensign. And then you get the Deep South, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia. Those have a lot in common. Could that be its own region? Then you got the Pacific Northwest, north, and I'm talking way north, like north of the Bay Area, California, Washington, Oregon, or at least West Washington and Oregon, with a bunch of trees and a green flag for its ensign. And then you get the northern interior, what I'm going to call it, with Idaho, Montana, Wyoming. Super rugged, individualistic, vast, wide open spaces and fierce independence. And then what about the Southwest? You got a lot of cultural similarities there. New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada. They got a lot of cultural, geographical similarities. And then what about Texas? Would it be part of the Southwest with its cactus and cowboy hat ensign? Or would it be its own thing? Would Texas be its own independent nation like it was before? I don't know. Those are just regions that I thought of off the top of my head, really. It'd be even more than that, right? If you look at just certain states' economies like California or Texas, I believe they're bigger than a lot of European nations' economies and gross domestic products. So balkanization, would that be a thing? This is less a podcast about how that might shake out and not who versus who, because I don't see the future. Right? I just don't. There's any number of ways that could shake out. Who allies with who and all that, I don't know. And it's literally just speculation. I have no idea. All just kind of pie in the sky musings, which I don't want to really waste your time with. What I would like to talk about more in depth is perhaps things you hadn't considered about war and about a civil war. Now, I should say, I wasn't alive during the first Civil War. I'm not that old. I don't have a master's degree in Civil War studies. I did get a quick crash course in what you might call Google and YouTube University. I did a lot more research for this episode than I do for most episodes, kind of tying that into my experience. But things you may want to consider if you think we are headed for, or Civil War 2.0 is a possibility. Anything's a possibility, but a substantial risk. First of all, what side are you going to be on? There's a civil war. I reckon there's going to be a draft, right? You look at, I discussed this in the Q&A, look at how many even young underage men served in the first Civil War. You think it's only going to be men? Maybe, hopefully. But what about your 11-year-old kids? Are they going to get drafted forcibly? Look at child soldiers in Africa. That's a real thing. Look at the child soldiers in the Civil War as young as 11, marching out on a battlefield. I thought about this today in relation to something totally different, but it kind of ties in here. It's said that necessity is the mother of invention. If that is true, is greed and or desperation the mother of brutality? It's something to consider. But what if you're drafted, right? Say you live in that Northeast, anywhere from Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey. Are you signing up? Or are you going when they forcibly make you march? Are you going to go fight and kill other Americans from other states? Going to fight against Texans? Do you think if you live in the Northeast, do you think they're more ideologically aligned than you in Texas? I guess two big questions for that is, if that's true, then why do you live in New England and not live in Texas, or live in the South, or live in the rugged, individualistic interior Northwest, like Idaho, Montana, Wyoming? Why don't you live there now in case that happens? What are you going to do? Are you going to flee? Are you going to go Harriet Tubman and underground railroad it till you get to what you would consider a more free, ideologically aligned part of America? Because here's one thing I have seen: when stuff descends into chaos, it can descend rather quickly. Better to bug out 5 years early than 1 minute too late. So I guess those are major things to consider. What if you're drafted? What if you're drafted to fight? You live in a blue state. I want to make this liberal versus conservative, but let's say you're drafted to fight for an ideology you don't really believe in. Are you going to go? Are you willing to stand in front of a trench and get shot because you say, I'm not going? Willing to spend, 2 to 20 years? I mean, our last war, the global war on terror, lasted 20 years. Are you willing to spend 20 years of your life in prison because you say, I'm not going to fight for you? And if you look at Civil War prisons, they were pretty brutal. Are you going to fight? Because if past is any indication of what another Civil War might look like, if you're anywhere between 11 and 80, you might be fighting. And especially the way we are now with all this gender confusion and gender roles, like a woman can do anything a man wants to do. Well, can she march out on a battlefield and get shot? Women might be getting drafted in the next one. Ready for that? For your ladies, for your daughters, for your wife. What if children become property of the state and the mom and the dad have to go off and fight? What if you get drafted? What if you forcibly get compelled to serve? Something maybe people don't consider. They maybe just think, I'm going to grab my AR-15 and fight for liberty. Are you going to have a choice depending on where you live as to what side you fight for? I don't know that a lot of people that kind of romanticize war, especially in American Civil War, have honestly thought a lot about what actual warfare entails. Let's talk about power vacuums. I believe there was probably quite a bit of atrocity done here on American soil during the Civil War, just because Many bad actors, many evil people took advantage of the situation. There are evil people committing evil acts right now in a, let's say, functioning society. But there are other people that don't commit evil just because they don't want to face the penalties of it. What happens when those penalties go away? Violent and non-violent crime. What do you think happens in those arenas during a civil war? Well, I'll fight them off with my AR-15. Well, what if they got a 10-star pinned to their chest? What if it's 200 of them versus you and your AR-15? And they have the color of authority. How about this one? Have you even thought about national debt? I don't want to quote numbers because the economy, in the 1860s was far different than the economy now. But look at what happened to the national debt and national spending during the Civil War. What do you think happens to taxes during a civil war? Do you think inflation and taxes are bad now? You reckon they're going to get better? Maybe after the war, depending on what side you're on. But wars cost money. Who pays for that? Have you thought about that? Have you thought about property confiscation? I believe that was a thing during the first Civil War. If the region you're in, they don't particularly like your ideology, your Facebook posts, your Instagram posts. If they decide in the new nation that civilian-owned guns now become property of the state, or if they think you support or sympathize with what they would consider an enemy government, then your entire private property gets confiscated. Civil asset forfeiture. What if that's a thing? Have you thought about that? What about shortages, rationing, and prices? What if it's an entire day's wages for a quart of barley? What if the currency changes and all the savings you have are no longer worth anything? Look into that in the Civil War. What if all your currency one day changes and the currency you hold on to literally isn't worth the paper that it's printed on? Have you thought about that? Have you thought about property destruction? What if you're in a border region? What if an enemy army, while you're off fighting somewhere else, comes in and marches and burns down your house, your block, your people hive, your cul-de-sac, your entire city? Have you studied Sherman's March to Atlanta, the March to the Sea? What if your entire region is burnt to the ground? Have you thought about that? What if the women are not forced to enlist and fight on a battlefield? What do you think happens in a civil war with bad actors when there are no strong men around to protect them? Have you thought about that? What about this one? Sanitation. May seem like a mundane thing, but several sources that I'm aware of say that many more soldiers died in the Civil War from disease, bacteria, than died of gunshot wounds. You may think that won't happen today, but bacteria, dysentery, they still kill people throughout the world. Supply chains are cut off or disrupted, or they're just not enough. There just aren't enough antibiotics. What if only certain elite members of the military rate antibiotics and you don't rate it, and you get dysentery, or you get a minor flesh wound that turns into gangrene, and there's battles going on. Logistics trains are tied up. They're not ambulatory. You can't walk, and there's hundreds of other men in a superdome, in a sports stadium, also full of dysentery and bacteria and diseases and gangrene. Have you thought about that? Have you thought about how long it might take? Now, when I signed up pre 9/11. We went to war. I'll tell you a story. I don't often tell war stories, and I certainly don't tell them about the gruesome firsthand accounts that I've seen and atrocities, honestly, on both sides. I won't talk about that, but I'll tell this story because it illustrates a point, and it's not gruesome. But the war previous to that for us, the Gulf War, was over in something like 100 hours. Well, I was there, 1st Marine Division, one of the very first units, as I understand it, across the line to invade Iraq. We were there in Kuwait, waiting for the war to happen. We crossed over. We fought for months. We took the capital. We took Baghdad. It fell. We fought in some other cities, working our way back, and then after 9 months, I think, we came back to the States. And we thought, hey, we won the war. We took the capital. We took down the Iraqi army. Victory. Kind of funny looking back on it, but we thought that was it. We came back and there was a big gathering debrief before we went on leave to go see our families, as we had just fought a war. And I don't remember the exact words of the speech or even who gave it. Something to the effect of, good job kicking butt over there in Iraq. Go take a few weeks of vacation and get ready because we're going back again. And I remember thinking, for what? We just won the war. Kind of funny looking back on it. Thought the war was over in a couple of months. It was still far longer than the previous war. 20 years. 20 years that war lasted. 2 decades. American Civil War 2.0, if it happens, could last a year. It could last 20 or more years. Are you familiar with the 100 Years' War? Are you familiar with the really, really kind of nuanced and complicated fall of the Roman Republic and how long that took? Thinking of some glorious one-time battle and it's over. Maybe, but it could last decades. It could last generations. Have you thought about that? What do you think happens to the grid during a civil war? What do you think happens to electricity, to power, to running water, to clean water, to the highway system, to the railroad system, when it all gets bombed, when it gets nuked, when it goes offline? Again, maybe for a year, maybe for decades. Have you thought about that? Are you ready for that? If there's fighting and services, water doesn't come out of the tap and lights don't turn on for decades. Have you thought about that? Are you ready for that? Take a deep breath now. Have you thought about this one? We, as in the United States, have nuclear weapons now. We have a lot. We have a lot of nuclear weapons. A lot of nuclear weapons. Spread out on bases all around the country. From Bangor, Maine to nuclear submarines throughout the world to different places, which actually some stuff might be classified. I did mention I work for a 3-letter government agency, but that I won't specify. But there's nuclear stuff all over this country. What happens to that? Who gets control of that? What part of that chain of command stays in whatever part claims to be the real United States? And there could be several people claiming to be the real United States. What if the capital moves several times? Who has control of those nukes? Who has control of all of those nukes? Do some of those nukes fall into different, say, balkanized territories, nation states? And then what happens if one of those starts losing and they're desperate and they're at the end of their rope They haven't had water or power or food. And they're literally starving to death, watching their family and loved ones suffer. And they have that, not real, but you get the idea, big red button. Do they push it? Have you thought about that? There's other ones on the list, but I think that's enough. There's a lot that goes into war. And again, I think a lot of times we romanticize war. Again, when I was a young boy from a small town in the South, I thought war was going to be glorious and a grand adventure. But that quote, war is hell, that phrase, I do believe, is attributed to Civil War General William Tecumseh Sherman. And I just looked it up, and I didn't even realize this, but it kind of fits in what I was saying when I was a young boy. The original quote, this is on Wikipedia, so I didn't actually hear him say this, but he originally said, "Look on war as on all glory, but boys, it is all hell." The exact quote I don't know, but that war is hell is attributed, I see, in multiple places to William Tecumseh Sherman. Here's another reading. "I am tired and sick of war. Its glory, it is all moonshine. It is only those who have near fired a shot, nor heard the shrieks and groans of the wounded, who cry aloud for blood, for vengeance, for desolation. War is hell." Again, I speak of war as a man who has been to war, as a grunt, as a U.S. Marine Corps combat veteran, as an infantryman, who's seen the effects of war, who's seen literally countless bodies lying on battlefields. I don't know if there'll be a Civil War II. I may or may not fight in it. I don't know. But I do have some idea of what war entails. What I want to ask you, men, is have you actually thought about it? I don't know the future. I don't know what will or won't happen. Again, I don't want to pretend to be a prophet because there's teachings in the Bible about false prophets. I don't know. What I do know is war can be a nasty business. And I do know Jesus says, "Let he who has no sword sell his cloak and buy one." And he says, "Watch and be ready." Several times, watch and be ready. Be ready, men. Spirit, soul, mind, and body. Be strong. Spirit, soul, mind, and body. I'm going to forego the tactical tip today as it's a deep philosophical episode. I'll give you some good warrior verses. Of course, Psalm 144, "Blessed be the Lord my rock, who trains my hands for war and my fingers for battle." How about Psalm 18? "It is God who arms me with strength. He makes my way perfect. He makes my feet like the feet of a deer. He sets me on high places. He teaches my hands to make war so that my arms can bend a bow of bronze." How about, let's just give the run of Psalm 91. "He who dwells in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty. I will say to the Lord, you are my refuge and my fortress, my God in whom I will trust. Surely you shall deliver me from the snare of the fowler and from the perilous pestilence. You shall cover me with your feathers, and under your wings shall I take refuge. Your truth shall be my shield and buckler. I shall not be afraid of the terror by night, nor of the arrow that flies by day, nor the pestilence that walks in darkness, nor the destruction that lays waste at noonday. 1,000 may fall at my side, 10,000 at my right hand, but it shall not come near me. Only with my eyes shall I look and see the reward of the wicked, because I have made the Lord, who is my refuge, even the Most High, my dwelling place. No evil shall befall me, nor shall any plague come near my dwelling. For you shall give your angels charge over me, to keep me in all my ways. In their hands they shall bear me up, lest I dash my foot against a stone. I shall tread upon the lion and the cobra, the young lion and the serpent I shall trample underfoot. Because I set my love upon you, therefore you deliver me. You set me on high, because I have known your name. I call upon you, and you answer me. You be with me in trouble. You deliver me and honor me. With long life, you satisfy me and show me your salvation. That's Psalm 91. If that psalm does not impact you, I don't know what to say, because it certainly impacts me. That an almighty God would save me time after time. And not just physically, for I should have been physically dead many times. I've felt the cold hand of death, only to have God save me. But more important than that, he saved me from a spiritual death. I was dead in my sins and trespasses. He made me alive in Christ. Whether we all die tomorrow or live to see Civil War 2.0 and live through it, that's all secondary to your relationship, to your salvation. With that, thanks for listening and have a blessed day.